The dust tasted of grit and despair, a fine, persistent powder coating the rough wool of the dress she wore, the inadequate barrier against the biting wind that whipped across the desolate landscape. Alara clutched the worn valise tighter, her knuckles white beneath the thin leather. This place, it wasn't just remote. It felt like the raw, exposed bone of the earth, stripped bare of everything soft and kind. The train had grown to a halt hours ago, depositing her and her fragile lie onto the splintered platform of a town that was little more than a cluster of weathered wood and squinting eyes. 49 Pines, the sign declared, bleached and leaning like a drunken sentinel. 49 Pines. It sounded like a place where things came to die slowly. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Every face seemed to bore into her, assessing, judging. They saw the travel stains, the cheap fabric of her dress, the wide, frightened eyes of a woman who clearly didn't belong. She was a creature of gaslight and crowded, unforgiving streets, not this vast, indifferent sky and endless horizon. But the streets she'd fled were far more dangerous than this emptiness. The name stitched onto the letter she carried, Mrs. Thomas Thorne, felt like a flimsy shield, easily pierced. It was a name she had borrowed, a life she hoped to steal, one breath at a time. The real Mrs. Thorne, she'd learned from the hushed whispers of her escape, had perished on the journey west, another casualty of the unforgiving trail. Alara had intercepted the correspondence, a desperate act born of cornered fear. Now, she wore the dead woman's name, a ghost haunting a future that wasn't hers. The weight of that deception was a physical burden, heavier than her valise. A man stood apart from the small cluster of townspeople gathered near the platform, his form lean and still against the chaotic movement of dust and wind. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, shadowing his face, and a badge glinted dully on his worn coat. A ranger. His presence radiated a quiet authority that was more unsettling than the overt suspicion of the others. He wasn't scanning the newcomers with idle curiosity. His gaze was steady, comprehensive, missing nothing. When his eyes, shadowed but intensely blue, settled on her, a shiver ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. It felt like he was looking not at the dress, the valise, or the name, but through her, into the hollow space where her truth resided. She forced herself to stand straighter, to meet his gaze with a fragile imitation of composure, but she felt her carefully constructed mask cracking under the pressure of his silent scrutiny. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just watched. It was a watchfulness that promised patience, a willingness to wait and see what the wind uncovered. The seconds stretched, taut and thin as stretched wire. The train whistle blew again, a mournful sound signaling its imminent departure, leaving her irrevocably stranded. Where was Thomas Thorne? The letter had promised he would meet her. Had he, too, succumbed to the harshness of this land? Or had her fraudulent reply somehow been discovered? Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of her resolve. She was alone, miles from anything familiar, her lie already faltering at the first hurdle. The ranger hadn't moved, his gaze unwavering. He saw the tremor in her hands, the way her eyes darted, searching for an answer, a rescuer, someone who wasn't there. He saw the raw fear beneath the thin veneer of a hopeful bride. It was a terrifying kind of seeing, one that bypassed the surface and penetrated the carefully guarded depths. He was danger, not because he seemed cruel, but because he seemed observant, and observation was the quickest route to exposure. She had planned this escape meticulously, or so she had thought. Every step from the stifling drawing rooms of the city, the whispers, the inescapable shame, had been aimed at this single, desperate gamble. A new name, a new life, purchased with the identity of a dead woman and the promise of marriage to a stranger in a forgotten corner of the world. It was a monstrous deceit, she knew, but the alternative had been ruin, a life sentenced to the shadows, burdened by a past that was not entirely her fault, but for which she would pay the highest price. Here, in the vastness, she had hoped to disappear, to become the Mrs. Thomas Thorne the letter described, a woman with a simple history, a woman whose biggest worry was the harshness of the land, not the specter of scandal haunting her every step. The ranger's gaze, however, made it clear that disappearing would be harder than she imagined. He was an anchor in this fluid, uncertain reality, and she felt herself drifting dangerously close to his unyielding presence. The wind howled, carrying dust and the scent of dry earth and something else, something wild and untamed. It mirrored the feeling stirring within her, a desperate, primal urge to flee, to hide, to become as invisible as the wind itself. But there was nowhere left to run. The train pulled away with a final shriek of metal, leaving her utterly alone on the platform, save for the silent, watchful figure of the ranger, who still hadn't spoken a single word, but whose gaze spoke volumes she desperately wished she couldn't read. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken questions and the raw, exposed vulnerability of a woman cornered by her own desperate gamble. The sun beat down, harsh and unforgiving, highlighting every imperfection, every travel-worn detail of her disguise. This was not the anonymity she had craved. It was a spotlight, with a single, discerning pair of eyes fixed upon her. The landscape itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The few townspeople dispersed, their curiosity sated for the moment, leaving Alara truly alone on the platform, the sound of the retreating train fading into the vast silence of the plains. The ranger remained, still unmoving, a statue carved from the same stoic material as the distant mountains. He hadn't approached her, hadn't spoken, but his presence was a physical weight in the air. Desperation lent her a fragile courage. She had to do something, anything, other than stand frozen like a rabbit before a snake. Clenching her valise, she took a tentative step towards the edge of the platform, looking towards the cluster of buildings that constituted 49 Pines. There was a general store, a saloon, a few rough-looking houses, and not a single sign of anyone who might be waiting for a bride. She swallowed, the dryness in her throat making the simple act difficult. Her mind raced, trying to conjure a plausible explanation for the absence of Thomas Thorne. A delay? An emergency? The letter had been precise about the date and time. He should be here. She risked another glance towards the ranger. He hadn't shifted, but she felt the intensity of his watch. He wasn't going to offer help. He was waiting to see what she would do. It felt like a test she was already failing. "Excuse me," she managed, her voice a reedy whisper against the wind, felt like shouting in the vast silence. The ranger turned his head slightly, acknowledging her without moving his body. His eyes were still in shadow under the brim of his hat. I was expected. Mr. Thomas Thorne?" His stillness was absolute. He didn't immediately reply. The silence stretched again, filled only by the persistent whine of the wind. She felt her face growing warm, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment and fear. Had he already guessed? Had he known the moment she stepped off the train? Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, quiet, but carried easily in the wind. It held no discernible emotion, just a flat statement of fact. "Thorne died 2 weeks ago." The words hit her like a physical blow. Died. The real Thomas Thorne, her intended husband, the anchor of her desperate plan, was dead. And not just recently dead, but 2 weeks ago. The letter she had forged, the timing she had relied on, was now hopelessly out of sync with reality. Her lie, already precarious, had just collapsed entirely. The name she carried was now a burden, a link to a dead man in a town where she was a complete stranger, under the watchful eye of a lawman who clearly saw more than she wanted him to. Her carefully constructed composure shattered. "Died?" she repeated, the word catching in her throat. "But the letter." I was told. Her voice trailed off, the flimsy excuse sounding pathetic even to her own ears. Who had told her? A forged letter wasn't a person. The ranger didn't fill the silence or demand an explanation. He simply waited. His patience was terrifying. He was caught in a flash flood out near the Lost Creek Pass. The ranger stated, his voice still flat, offering details she didn't want to hear, details that cemented the finality of her situation. Body wasn't found for days. Alara stared at him, her mind reeling. Lost Creek Pass. She didn't know where that was. but it sounded as desolate as the rest of this place. Her intended husband was dead. The man whose name she had appropriated was dead. The marriage that was supposed to legitimize her presence here would never happen. She was a woman alone, with no husband, no connections, and a name that belonged to the deceased wife of a man who was also now deceased. The tangled web of her deception suddenly seemed impossibly complex and perilous. The ranger took a step towards her, slow and measured. She flinched back instinctively, bumping into the wooden railing of the platform. He stopped, his gaze still fixed on her face. "You his bride?" he asked, the question quiet, but carrying the weight of an interrogation. She hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. The name. Should she use the dead woman's name? Or confess? Confess what? That she was nobody, running from a past she couldn't name? The ranger's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He saw her hesitation. He saw the calculation flicker across her features. He knew. He didn't know the details, perhaps, but he knew she wasn't who she claimed to be. The air crackled with the unspoken accusation. "Yes," she said, the lie feeling like ash in her mouth. "Yes, I am. Alara. Mrs. Thorne." He didn't react, didn't confirm or deny the name. Alara. It wasn't the name on the forged letter, which had simply referred to Mrs. Thomas Thorne. She hadn't needed to use a first name until this moment. The real Mrs. Thorne's first name had been Sarah. Another slip. Another layer of her lie exposed to his unnerving perception. She cursed herself internally. Fear was a clumsy companion. "Didn't know Thorne was expecting a bride," the ranger said, his tone still neutral, but the words were laced with quiet skepticism. "He wasn't the talking type. We corresponded," Alara said, trying to inject a hopeful, bride-like quality into her voice that was utterly absent. For some time she fumbled in her valise, pulling out the carefully preserved forged letter, the one addressed to Mrs. Thomas Thorne, the one she had replied to, the one she had used to arrange this journey. "See? He wrote to me." She held it out, her hand trembling slightly. The ranger didn't take the letter. His gaze flickered down to her hand, then back up to her face. He was looking at her, not the paper. "Wasn't his writing," he stated flatly. The blood drained from Alara's face. How could he know? He hadn't even touched the letter, hadn't read a single word. How could he possibly know it wasn't Thomas Thorne's writing? Unless he knew Thorne's writing intimately. Unless he had seen it often. Perhaps they were friends? No, he had said Thorne wasn't the talking type. Acquaintances, then? Or perhaps he had been the one to find the body, the belongings. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her. He saw her shock, her terror. A muscle twitched in his jaw, the only sign of emotion he allowed himself. "Saw his hand often enough," the ranger said, elaborating just slightly, confirming her fear that he had reason to be familiar with the dead man's affairs. "Manifests, reports, part of the job. Of course, a ranger would handle paperwork. He would know the handwriting of the people in his territory." Her lie wasn't just flimsy. It was fundamentally flawed, built on assumptions about a dead man she had never met and a place she knew nothing about. The ranger had seen the truth, or at least, he had seen the lie, from the moment he looked at her. He knew she wasn't Thorne's bride, and he knew the letter was a forgery. She was caught, trapped in the vast, empty space between her past and a future that had just dissolved. The wind continued to blow, indifferent to her plight, carrying the scent of dust and distant, unforgiving mountains. She stood on the platform, exposed and vulnerable, under the silent, knowing gaze of the lawman who had seen the truth in her carefully constructed lie. The ranger didn't press further about the letter or her identity, a forbearance that was both unnerving and marginally reassuring. It wasn't an act of kindness, she sensed, but a strategic pause. He knew he had her cornered. There was no need for haste. "You got anywhere to go?" he asked after a long silence, his tone still flat, lacking any hint of welcome or sympathy. Alara hugged herself, the chill of the wind seeping into her bones. Where did she have to go? The address on the forged letter was Thorne's cabin, somewhere she had only ever imagined. Now, even that imagined refuge was gone, belonging to a dead man. Going back was impossible. Staying here seemed equally impossible, exposed as she was. "No," she admitted, the word barely audible. I don't." He nodded slowly, his eyes still on her. "Town's small. Not many places for a woman alone," he paused, his gaze sweeping over the rough buildings of 49 Pines.
No hotel.
"Boarding house closed last year." Her heart sank further. He was laying out the harsh realities of her situation, not with malice, but with the brutal honesty of the landscape itself. There were no easy options, no hidden welcoming corners. She was adrift. "The storekeeper's wife sometimes takes in boarders," he finally offered, a thread of possibility in the otherwise bleak assessment. "If she's feeling charitable." "You got money?" Money. She had some, enough for the journey, enough to buy a few necessities, but not enough to sustain her indefinitely, not in a place where opportunities for a woman like her would be scarce to non-existent, and where her past could catch up if she couldn't make herself invisible. "A little," she admitted, carefully vague. He seemed to weigh her answer, his gaze steady and assessing. "Mrs. Gable runs the store," he said, offering a practical piece of information without offering aid. "You could ask her. But she's particular." Particular. She imagined what particular meant in this context. Respectable. Married. Without a past that clung to her like the dust. She doubted she would meet Mrs. Gable's criteria. Yet it was the only suggestion offered. She had to try. "Thank you," she murmured, the words feeling inadequate. The ranger gave another slow nod. He still hadn't introduced himself, hadn't asked her name directly. Not the one she offered. Not the one she carried on the letter. He knew she wasn't Mrs. Thomas Thorne, Elara or otherwise, but he hadn't revealed the extent of his knowledge to the townspeople, who had since drifted away. He hadn't arrested her for forgery or deception. He was simply waiting. He finally moved, a fluid, economical motion. He walked towards a sturdy-looking horse tied near the platform. "I'll be around," he said, his voice reaching her as he swung himself into the saddle with practiced ease. The statement felt less like a reassurance and more like a quiet promise of continued surveillance. He was letting her go for now, but he wasn't letting her off the hook. He rode away at a steady pace, disappearing quickly into the vast, shimmering heat haze of the afternoon. Elara watched him go, a knot of fear and uncertainty tightening in her stomach. She was alone again, but the feeling of being watched persisted long after he was out of sight. His silent, discerning gaze felt imprinted on her skin. Clutching her valise, she descended the steps of the platform, her boots crunching on the dry earth. The walk towards the town felt like crossing a vast, exposed stage. Every window seemed like an eye, every shadow a potential hiding place for judgment. She reached the main street, which was little more than a wide, dusty track, and made her way towards the building with the sign that read General Merchandise Gable. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dry goods, leather, and something vaguely medicinal. A woman with sharp eyes and a perpetually pursed mouth stood behind a counter stacked high with goods. Mrs. Gable. She looked up as Elara entered, her expression immediately hardening. The ranger's assessment had been accurate. Mrs. Gable was very particular. "Yes?" the woman asked, her voice clipped and unwelcoming. Elara straightened her shoulders, forcing a composure she didn't feel. "Good afternoon," she began, trying for a polite smile. "I'm Elara Thorne. I was hoping you might have a room to let." Mrs. Gable's eyes narrowed. "Thorne? Thomas Thorne's bride." The news of the dead man's expected arrival, and her presence, had clearly already circulated. This small town was a hive of observation and gossip. "Yes," Elara confirmed, the lie still necessary, still the only explanation she had. A look of suspicion, colder than the wind outside, settled on Mrs. Gable's face. "He's dead, you know," she stated, as if Elara might not have heard the news less than an hour ago. "Yes," Elara said softly. I was told." Mrs. Gable eyed her up and down, taking in the dusty dress, the signs of travel, the lack of a proper escort or reception. Didn't seem like Thorne to order a bride. Kveitman. Kept to himself, she echoed the ranger's sentiment, adding another layer of doubt to Alara's story. The town had its narrative of Thomas Thorne, and Alara did not fit into it. He was looking forward to. Alara struggled to find words that sounded convincing, that painted a picture of a correspondence and anticipation that had never existed. But the lies felt hollow, thin, unable to withstand the scrutiny of this shrewd woman. Mrs. Gable leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice, though the sharp edge remained. He died 2 weeks ago. Why you only arriving now? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Why the delay? A respectable bride would have been here sooner. Alara's mind raced. She couldn't explain the forged letters, the time it took to intercept them, the desperate scramble to arrange passage. She couldn't explain that her arrival now was based on the timeline of a dead man's final letter, which she had used as her entry point. Travel delays, she mumbled, grasping at the weakest of straws. The weather was bad further east. Mrs. Gable snorted softly, a sound of pure disbelief. She clearly didn't believe a word. The ranger had seen the truth in her eyes. Mrs. Gable saw it in the inconsistencies of her story and the general air of something being terribly wrong. Don't got rooms, Mrs. Gable said abruptly, turning her back and beginning to rearrange some bolts of fabric on a shelf, a clear dismissal. Try the saloon. They got beds upstairs. Not the kind of place for a decent woman, though the implication was clear. Mrs. Gable had already decided Alara was not a decent woman, based on her appearance, her story, and the circumstances of her arrival linked to a dead man. The saloon suggestion was an insult, a way of placing Alara firmly outside the bounds of respectability. Alara's face burned. She wanted to protest, to plead, to somehow scrub away the stain of suspicion that had attached itself to her the moment she stepped off the train. But she knew it was useless. Mrs. Gable had made up her mind. The judgment of this small, isolated community was swift and unforgiving. She turned and walked out of the store, the small bell above the door jingling mockingly behind her. Back on the dusty street, the sun still beat down, the wind still whipped around her, and she felt utterly, completely lost. The ranger's words echoed in her mind. Town's small, not many places for a woman alone. He had stated it as a fact, a simple observation of the harsh reality. Now she was experiencing that reality firsthand. She looked down the street towards the saloon, a rough-looking building with swinging doors. The thought of going in filled her with dread. But where else was there? Mrs. Gable had shut the door to her, and the ranger's silent watch felt like a net closing in. She was a fraud in a town with no patience for deception, linked to a dead man no one expected to marry. The future she had desperately hoped to build here was disintegrating before it had even begun. The weight of her valise felt heavier than ever, a repository of a past she couldn't escape and a future she couldn't grasp. The dust of 49 Pines settled over her, coating her like a shroud. She was a ghost bride in a town of the living, and one of the living, a silent ranger, knew she didn't belong. The saloon was as unwelcoming as Mrs. Gable had implied, though in a different, more boisterous way. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and cheap whiskey. Rough laughter and the clatter of glasses filled the space. Eyes turned towards her as she entered, assessing her with open curiosity, a stark contrast to the veiled suspicion of Mrs. Gable. But this curiosity held a different kind of threat, a hungry, predatory edge that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She felt utterly out of place, a fragile bird fallen into a den of wolves. She approached the bar, where a burly man with a stained apron was wiping down the counter. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely audible over the din. "I was told you might have rooms upstairs." The bartender stopped his wiping and looked her over. A slow grin spread across his face, revealing a missing tooth. "Rooms, eh? Lookin' for a place to rest your head, sweetheart." The sweetheart, was coated in an oily familiarity that made her skin crawl. Depends what kind of rest you're looking for. Elara recoiled slightly, understanding the implication immediately. This wasn't a proper lodging house. The rooms upstairs served a different purpose entirely. Her face flushed, this time not with embarrassment but with a rising wave of fear and indignation. She had fled one kind of degradation only to find herself on the brink of another. "No," she said, her voice firmer now, laced with a desperate defiance. "Just a bed. A clean bed." The bartender chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "Clean beds cost extra, darlin', and payments usually expected in kind. If you catch my drift." He leaned closer, his breath reeking of alcohol. She took a step back, shaking her head.
"No."
"Thank you. I've made a mistake." She turned to leave, the eyes of the men in the saloon following her, their laughter and murmurs rising as she retreated. The street outside felt like a blessed escape, despite the dust and the wind and the lack of options. Standing on the dusty track again, she felt a wave of despair wash over her, cold and absolute. Mrs. Gable had shut the door of respectability. The saloon had opened the door to something else entirely, something she couldn't countenance. Where could she go? The sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the town. Night was coming, and she had nowhere to shelter. She saw him then, the ranger. He was seated on a wooden bench outside the general store, observing her from a distance. He wasn't actively pursuing her, but he hadn't left, either. He was simply there, a silent, constant presence on the edge of her desperation. Their eyes met across the dusty street. She saw no judgment in his gaze this time, just that same quiet, unnerving observation. He had likely seen her enter and leave the saloon. He knew the kind of reception she would have received. He knew she was running out of time and options. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. He didn't beckon her, didn't stand up. He simply continued to watch. He was allowing her to flounder, perhaps to see what she would do, to see how far her desperation would push her. Felt like another test. Driven by a combination of fear of the coming night and a strange, reluctant pull towards the only person who seemed to see her, even in her deception, she began to walk towards him. Each step was a victory over her fear, a small act of defiance against the circumstances that were crushing her. She stopped a few feet away from the bench, not wanting to intrude, but unable to move further away. "Mrs. Gable." "She didn't have a room," Elara stated, the words feeling flat and inadequate. The ranger nodded slowly, as if this outcome had been entirely predictable. "Told you she was particular." And the saloon, she couldn't bring herself to fully articulate the bartender's proposition. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of understanding, a brief, almost imperceptible acknowledgement of the threat she had faced. It was the closest thing to sympathy she had seen from him. "Not a place for a woman alone," he finished for her, his voice still quiet, still lacking overt emotion, but carrying a weight of shared knowledge. He knew the dangers of this place. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted again, the vulnerability stark and raw in the fading light. He shifted on the bench, finally looking away from her, his gaze sweeping across the town and the empty plains beyond. "Night comes fast out here," he said, stating another simple, brutal fact of this landscape. She waited, her heart pounding. Was he going to help her? Or was he simply confirming her dire predicament? He had seen her lie, knew she was a fraud. He had no reason to offer her assistance, least of all shelter. Yet he hadn't turned her away entirely. He sighed softly, the sound barely audible above the wind. It was the first sign of weariness she had detected in him. "Thorne's cabin," he said, speaking the name of the dead man's home, the destination of her forged journey. "It's empty now." Elara looked at him, confused. Empty. Of course it was empty. Thorne was dead. "It's a few miles out," the ranger continued, still not looking directly at her. "Rough place. Not fitted for comfort." Was he suggesting? Her mind dared to hope, then immediately recoiled. It was Thorn's cabin, the cabin of the man whose identity she had exploited. And going there would mean accepting his help, the help of the man who knew her secret. It felt dangerous in a different way, a surrender of her carefully guarded independence, a deepening of her entanglement with the consequences of her lie. I couldn't, she stammered. It was his. The ranger finally turned his head back to look at her, his gaze steady and direct. He's dead? He repeated, the simple truth cutting through the complexity of her feelings. Cabin's just wood and stone now. Belongs to nobody, till someone claims it. He paused, then added, his voice low, be safer than the saloon. Safer. The word resonated deeply. She had been living in a state of constant, quiet terror for weeks. First from the situation she was fleeing, then from the journey, and now from this town and the exposure of her lie. Safety seemed an impossible luxury. It's isolated, he warned, as if to temper any relief she might feel. Creek nearby, but you'd need to draw water. Firewood to chop. Food to find. He was listing the hardships, painting a realistic picture of the primitive existence she would face. It wasn't an offer of comfort, but of basic survival, earned through labor and resilience. I can work, she said quickly, wanting to prove herself capable, wanting to show him she wasn't simply a helpless woman. I'm not afraid of work. The city had taught her many things, though none of them were suited to this environment. But she was resourceful, adaptable. She had to be. He seemed to consider her words, his gaze unwavering. There was still no warmth in his expression, but the hard edges had softened slightly, replaced by a quiet assessment. He wasn't offering charity. He was offering a possibility, contingent on her ability to endure the demanding nature of the place. It wasn't a hand reaching out, but a path pointed out, shrouded in difficulty. He knew she was a fraud, linked to a dead man, but he was offering her a temporary refuge in that dead man's home. It was a strange, silent acknowledgement of her impossible situation, and a reluctant concession to the basic need for shelter from the coming night. The wind howled again, a reminder of the unforgiving elements waiting to descend. Thorn's empty cabin, under the silent eye of the ranger who knew her secret, seemed like the only precarious foothold in a world determined to swallow her whole. The ranger stood up, finally breaking his long stillness on the bench. The movement was deliberate, unhurried. I'll ride you out, he said, his voice still quiet, a simple statement of intent. Too far to walk tonight. Alara felt a surge of relief, quickly followed by a fresh wave of anxiety. Riding with him meant spending time in his company, under his scrutiny, solidifying the strange, unspoken alliance that seemed to be forming between them, an alliance based on his knowledge of her deception and her absolute need for shelter. It felt dangerous, exposing, but also, paradoxically, safer than being alone in the deepening twilight. Thank you, she said, meaning it deeply, despite her fear. It was a small act of assistance, but in her current predicament it felt monumental. He didn't reply, simply walked towards his horse. He didn't offer a hand to help her mount, expecting her, she assumed, to manage on her own. She approached the horse nervously. She had ridden before, but only in controlled environments, gentle rides in city parks. This was a sturdy, rangy animal built for distance and rough terrain. She gathered the skirt of her dress, placed her foot in the stirrup, and awkwardly swung her leg over, settling precariously behind his saddle. He remained still, allowing her to find her balance. Once she was settled, clinging uncertainly to the back of his saddle, he clucked to the horse, and they set off at a steady trot, leaving the small cluster of buildings behind. The dust rose around them, catching the last rays of the setting sun. They rode in silence, the only sounds the rhythmic hoofbeats of the horse and the relentless sigh of the wind. Alara focused on keeping her balance, her hands gripping the saddle, her body swaying with the horse's movement. The ranger rode with an easy competence that spoke of countless hours in the saddle. He was a natural extension of the animal, moving with a quiet, contained power. Sitting so close to him, she was acutely aware of his presence. The solid breadth of his back, the scent of leather, horse, and something clean and outdoorsy. He wasn't a large man, but his stillness and economy of movement gave him an impression of considerable strength. As they rode away from the town, the landscape opened up, vast and empty under the immense sky. The mountains in the distance turned purple and gray as the light faded. The scale of the place was overwhelming, dwarfing human endeavors, making her own small, desperate struggles feel insignificant. It was beautiful in a stark, brutal way, a beauty that demanded respect and offered no quarter. She risked a glance at the back of his head. His hat was still pulled low, concealing his face. She wondered what he was thinking. Was he reviewing her lies, speculating about her past? Or was he simply focused on the trail ahead, his mind empty of anything but the practicalities of the journey? It was impossible to tell. His silence was a shield, revealing nothing. They rode for what felt like a long time, the darkness gathering around them. The stars began to appear, incredibly bright and numerous in the absence of city lights. The air grew colder. She shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter. She felt him shift slightly. He didn't speak, but a moment later, something warm and heavy was placed around her shoulders. His coat. She gasped softly, startled by the unexpected gesture. It was a thick, lined coat, carrying his scent, the rough fabric warm against her skin. It offered a physical barrier against the cold, a small, tangible act of protection. "Thank you," she whispered, the words swallowed by the wind. He didn't reply, didn't acknowledge her thanks. He simply continued to ride, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the trail. The coat felt like a heavy weight, imbued with his silent, complicated presence. It was a gesture that contradicted the earlier, terrifying perception of his unyielding scrutiny. He saw her vulnerability, her fear, and he had offered this small, wordless comfort. It didn't erase the fact that he knew she was a fraud, but it added a layer of complexity to her understanding of him. He wasn't simply a lawman waiting to uncover her. He was a man capable of quiet, practical kindness. After what seemed like an eternity, he slowed the horse. Ahead, nestled in a small copse of trees near a winding creek bed, she saw a low, rough-hewn cabin. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, a surprising sign of life. "That's Thorn's," the ranger said, his voice low. Alara looked at the cabin. It looked small, sturdy, and profoundly isolated. The faint glow of firelight in the windows was both welcoming and eerie, the light of a home whose owner was dead. As they drew closer, she realized the smoke meant someone was already there. The ranger dismounted with practiced ease, then turned to help her. This time he offered a hand, his grip firm and steady as she swung her leg over and slid to the ground, her legs stiff from the ride. He still didn't speak, just held her arm briefly to steady her before releasing her. A figure emerged from the cabin, silhouetted against the firelight. It was a woman, tall and lean, carrying a lantern. "Sarah," the ranger said, and the name hung in the air, heavy with a significance Alara didn't immediately grasp. Sarah, the name of the real Mrs. Thomas Thorn. The woman approached, raising the lantern, its light illuminating her face. She was weathered but strong-looking, her eyes sharp and intelligent. She looked at the ranger, then her gaze shifted to Alara, standing awkwardly beside the horse. Her eyes narrowed slightly in assessment. "Heard you were in town, Thorn," the woman named Sarah said to the ranger, her voice low and calm. She didn't sound like a mail-order bride. She sounded like someone who belonged here, someone resilient and capable. The ranger nodded. "Had a visitor. Needed shelter," he gestured towards Alara. "This is Alara." He introduced her using the first name she had offered to Mrs. Gable. The name that wasn't on the forged letter, the name that was hers, but one she had only used in her desperate moment of panic. He didn't introduce her as Mrs. Thorn. He hadn't exposed her fully to this woman, not yet. Sarah's gaze lingered on Alara, taking in her appearance, her obvious discomfort. She didn't offer a smile or a conventional greeting. Her assessment was quiet, thorough, and Alara felt a prickle of fear. Had the ranger told her? Did she know who Alara was supposed to be? "Cabin's cold," Sarah said, her voice still calm, addressing Alara directly now. "But the fire's going. Come inside." It wasn't a warm invitation, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was a practical offer of shelter, extended by a woman who seemed as much a part of this harsh landscape as the trees and the creek. Alara hesitated, looking from Sarah to the ranger, who stood silently by his horse, watching them both. He had brought her here, to the cabin of the dead man, and delivered her into the care of a woman named Sarah, the name of the real Mrs. Thomas Thorne. The layers of this encounter were complex and unsettling. She still didn't understand why the ranger was helping her, why he hadn't exposed her completely. But standing there in the dark, with the wind biting and nowhere else to go, the small, warm glow from the cabin felt like the only safe harbor. She nodded, a gesture of acceptance and weary gratitude. "Thank you," she murmured to Sarah, then risked a glance at the ranger. "Thank you, Thorne." He met her gaze, and in the faint starlight, his eyes seemed less guarded than before, though still unreadable. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't say "you're welcome." He simply watched as Alara walked towards the cabin, towards the woman named Sarah, towards a future built on the fragile foundation of a necessary lie, a future she would now navigate under the silent, discerning gaze of the ranger who had seen her truth and, for reasons she couldn't yet comprehend, had chosen not to reveal it entirely. The wind howled around the cabin, a constant reminder of the wild, untamed world outside, a world that mirrored the unpredictable terrain of her own path ahead. Inside the cabin, the fire cast flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls, providing a warmth that chased away the chill of the night. Sarah didn't ask Alara questions immediately. She simply motioned towards a rough table and 2 chairs, then returned to tending the fire, adding more wood to the flames. The silence in the cabin was different from the silence outside. It was quieter, more contained, filled with the crackling of the fire and the soft sounds of Sarah's movements. Alara sat gingerly on the chair, her body aching from the ride. She looked around the cabin. It was sparse, functional. A small cot in one corner, a few shelves with tin plates and cups, simple tools hanging on the walls. It was clearly a place for survival, not comfort. She wondered what Thomas Thorne had been like, the man who had lived here, the man whose life she had attempted to usurp. The ranger had said he wasn't the talking type. This cabin reflected that. It spoke of a solitary, practical existence. Sarah finished with the fire and turned, her gaze settling on Alara again. "Thorne said you needed a place," she said, her voice calm. "This is it for now. There's water in the bucket by the door. Ought to boil it before you drink." "Thank you," Alara said again, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for this basic provision. "It's very kind of you." Sarah didn't reply, her expression unreadable. She wasn't warm, but she wasn't hostile either. She simply seemed observant, assessing. Alara wondered about the relationship between Sarah and the dead man. Was she a relative? A friend? The Real intended bride? The ranger had introduced her by the name of the real Mrs. Thorne. It seemed too great a coincidence. "You are Sarah?" Alara asked tentatively. The woman nodded. "Sarah Thorne, Tom's sister." Tom, not Thomas, his sister. Relief, faint and brief, washed over Alara. This Sarah wasn't the real mail-order bride. The ranger had introduced her as Sarah, Sarah Thorne. The truth of their relationship clicked into place. She was the dead man's sister, likely here to settle his affairs, or perhaps she had lived with him. Her connection to the cabin was legitimate, and the ranger knew her. That's how he knew Thorne's handwriting. That's how he knew Thorne wasn't expecting a bride. He would have known through Sarah. I am Alara," Alara said, using her own name, the one the ranger had used. The lie felt less necessary here, in this isolated cabin, facing the dead man's sister. I was supposed to marry Thomas. Your brother." Sarah's expression didn't change. She had likely heard the news, seen Alara arrive in town claiming to be the bride. She knew her brother wasn't expecting anyone. The ranger must have explained something to her, enough to warrant bringing Alara here. Tom didn't mention expecting a wife, Sarah stated, her voice flat, echoing the ranger's words earlier. It wasn't an accusation, just a simple statement of fact that highlighted the glaring inconsistency in Alara's story. Alara hesitated. How much could she reveal? How much should she reveal? The ranger knew something was wrong, but hadn't exposed her completely. Sarah, his sister, seemed equally reserved in her judgment. Perhaps, just perhaps, they were not as quick to condemn as Mrs. Gable. We corresponded by letter, Alara began, choosing her words carefully. I was in a difficult situation. In the city. I saw his advertisement for a bride. It seemed a way out. She couldn't bring herself to admit to the forgery, the intercepting of letters. Not yet, but she could hint at the desperation that had driven her. Sarah watched her, her gaze steady. She didn't interrupt, didn't press for details. She simply listened, her expression thoughtful. I didn't know him, Alara admitted, the words feeling like a confession. Only through his letters. And he didn't know me. Not truly, this much was true. The letters she had read were the ones the real Mrs. Thorne had written, describing herself. Alara had simply adopted that persona in her replies. You traveled all this way, Sarah said quietly, her tone neither sympathetic nor harsh. It was simply an observation of the monumental journey Alara had undertaken based on a premise that was now tragically invalid. I had nowhere else to go, Alara repeated, the phrase a refrain of her desperation. My circumstances in the city were impossible. She left it at that, a vague explanation of a specific dangerous past. She couldn't name the true reason for her flight, the scandal that had threatened to engulf her. Not to a stranger, not even the sister of the dead man she was impersonating. Sarah nodded slowly, as if she understood the concept of impossible circumstances, of needing to flee. This land, it's hard, she said. Takes a lot to make a life here. Tom, he understood that. She looked around the cabin, her gaze softening slightly as she looked at her brother's belongings. He was a good man, quiet, hard-working. Alara listened, absorbing these small fragments of information about the man whose name she had used. A quiet, hard-working man. To fit the cabin, the solitary life. I'm sorry about your brother, Alara said sincerely. The man was dead, her plan ruined, but the human cost wasn't lost on her. Thank you, Sarah replied. He belonged here. Died doing what he knew. She paused, then looked at Alara again. You don't belong here. Not yet. This place. It has to be earned. Earned. The word hung in the air. She had earned her place in the city's polite society through birth and circumstance, a place she had then lost. Now, she was being told this new life, this survival, had to be earned through struggle and adaptation. She looked at Sarah, a woman who clearly belonged, who had earned her place in this harsh land. There was a quiet strength about her, a resilience forged by the elements. I'm willing to work, Alara said, her voice firm, to learn. I don't expect anything for free. Sarah met her gaze, assessing her sincerity. A long moment passed in silence, filled only by the crackling fire. Alara didn't look away, didn't flinch. She had nothing left to lose by showing her resolve. Finally, Sarah nodded again, a decisive movement. All right, she said. You can stay tonight. We'll figure something out in the morning. She didn't offer long-term solutions, only the immediate necessity of shelter. It was a practical arrangement, devoid of sentimentality. The ranger had brought her here, and Sarah, the dead man's sister, was granting her temporary refuge in his cabin, knowing she was a fraud, but offering a chance nonetheless. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with the potential for discovery and the immense challenge of survival. But for this one night, she was safe from the wind, the saloon, and the immediate threat of being completely alone. The silent, knowing gaze of the ranger and the quiet assessment of Sarah Thorne were her only guides in this new, precarious reality. Alara spent the next few days at Thorne's cabin, the arrangement with Sarah silent and provisional. Sarah was a woman of few words, but her actions were clear. She expected Alara to contribute. Alara helped with the chores Sarah assigned, fetching water from the creek, gathering firewood, sweeping the cabin. The work was hard, physically demanding in a way Alara had never experienced. Her hands, accustomed to embroidery needles and teacups, quickly became calloused and sore. Her muscles ached constantly, but there was a strange satisfaction in the physical labor, a grounding reality that quieted the anxious chatter of her mind. It was a different kind of exhaustion than the one brought on by fear, a weariness that felt earned and clean. Sarah observed her steadily, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She didn't offer praise or criticism, simply watched as Alara struggled, then adapted. Alara tried to be useful, learning quickly, anticipating tasks before she was asked. She was desperate to prove her worth, to show Sarah, and perhaps the absent ranger, that she was not simply a burden or a fraud, but someone capable of resilience. The ranger, Thorn, visited the cabin occasionally. He would ride up quietly, dismount, and spend time talking with Sarah. Their conversations were brief, often about the land, the weather, the local concerns. He still spoke little, his gaze still intensely observant. His interactions with her remained sparse and practical. A quiet nod, a brief observation about her work, a shared glance that seemed to acknowledge the unspoken truth between them. One afternoon, as Alara was struggling to chop firewood with a clumsy axe, Thorn approached her. Sarah was inside the cabin. He stopped a few feet away, watching her awkward attempts. Alara felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She was clearly inept at this fundamental task. He didn't comment on her lack of skill. Instead, he took the axe from her hand. His fingers brushed hers for a brief moment, and she felt the rough texture of his skin, the solid strength of his hand. He then demonstrated the proper way to swing the axe, the movement fluid and powerful. The wood split cleanly with a single blow. "Use your weight," he said, his voice low. "Not just your arms." He handed the axe back to her. Alara gripped the handle, trying to mimic his posture, his movement. It felt awkward and unwieldy in her hands. She swung, putting more of her body into it this time. The axe head buried itself in the wood but didn't split it. She struggled to pull it free. Thorn watched patiently. He didn't offer to do it for her. "Follow through," he instructed. "Let the momentum do the work." She tried again, focusing on his words, on the feeling of the axe head swinging. This time the wood split, not cleanly like his, but it split. A small victory, a sense of accomplishment, small but significant, bloomed in her chest. She looked at him, a genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in a long while. "Thank you," she said. He gave that small, almost imperceptible nod that was his primary form of acknowledgement. His gaze held hers for a moment longer than usual, and she saw something shift in his eyes, a flicker of approval, recognition. It was gone before she could be certain, but the possibility warmed her more than the physical exertion. Later that evening, Sarah and Thorn were talking quietly by the fire. Alara was sitting apart, mending a tear in her dress. She wasn't eavesdropping, but the cabin was small, and their voices carried. "She works hard," Sarah said, her tone still neutral, but Alara detected a hint of observation, a report on Alara's performance. "She's city-bred," Thorn replied. "Doesn't know the ways out here." "She learns," Sarah stated. A silence followed. Alara held her breath, waiting to see if he would comment on her past, on her lie. But he didn't. "Town's been quiet," Thorn said, changing the subject. "Except for that fellow asking questions." Alara's blood ran cold. "Fellow asking questions? About whom? What kind of questions?" Sarah asked. "About anyone new," Thorn replied, his voice low. "Anyone passing through. Described a woman. Said she might be heading this way." Alara's hands trembled, the needle slipping from her fingers. Her past. It was catching up to her. The man described must be looking for her. She knew who it likely was, a man sent by those she had defied, a man known for his persistence and lack of scruple. What did he look like? Sarah asked. Clean suit, Thorn said. City man. Didn't fit. A city man. That confirmed her fears. The man sent to retrieve her, or worse. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had thought she was safe here, hidden away in this remote corner of the world. But the world and the past had a way of finding you. Did you tell him about Ilara? Sarah asked. A tense silence followed. Ilara strained to hear his answer, her heart pounding in her ears. No, Thorn finally said. Didn't mention her. Said I hadn't seen anyone matching that description. Ilara let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He hadn't told him. The ranger, who knew her secret, who could have easily handed her over to the man from her past, had chosen to protect her instead. He had lied for her. Sarah didn't ask why he had lied. She simply accepted his statement. There was an implicit understanding between them, a recognition of the unspoken circumstances. Ilara sat frozen, the mending forgotten. The ranger knew her secret, knew she was a fraud who had used a dead man's name to escape her past. And now, her past had sent someone looking for her, and the ranger had deliberately concealed her presence. Why? He owed her nothing. He represented the law, the very thing she was running from. Yet he had chosen to shield her. His quiet observation, his practicality, his unexpected act of providing his coat, his brief lesson with the axe, and now this protecting her from the man seeking her, it all added up to a picture of a man far more complex than the stoic, unreadable lawman she had first encountered. He saw her vulnerability, her effort, her fear, and he had made a choice. A choice that put him, however subtly, between her and the danger pursuing her. She looked at him across the cabin. He was silhouetted against the firelight, his face in shadow. She still didn't fully understand him, but the fear she had felt in his presence had begun to transform into something else, a fragile thread of trust, a reliance on his quiet strength and his unpredictable, yet consistent, acts of protection. The shadow of her past had arrived, but for the moment, she was still hidden, shielded by the silent watchfulness of the ranger who saw the truth in her lies and had chosen to keep it. The cabin felt less like a temporary refuge and more like a fragile fortress, defended not by walls, but by the quiet, unspoken understanding between her, the dead man's sister, and the enigmatic lawman who knew her deepest secret. The wind outside still howled, but for the first time in a long time, Ilara felt a glimmer of something other than despair, a tentative hope, anchored in the quiet strength of the two people who had unexpectedly offered her shelter in this unforgiving land. The knowledge that the man from her past was searching for her hung over Ilara like a shroud, a constant, chilling reminder of the danger that had followed her across the continent. She worked harder, driven by a renewed sense of urgency. She needed to be indispensable, to earn her keep in this remote corner of the world, to become so much a part of the landscape that she would be difficult to uproot. Sarah continued to observe her, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a quiet acceptance that Ilara sensed but couldn't name. Perhaps Thorn had spoken to her more about the situation, or perhaps Sarah, with her deep understanding of the land and its harsh necessities, simply recognized the raw, desperate drive to survive that fueled Ilara. Thorn's visits became more frequent, or perhaps Ilara simply noticed them more acutely now, aware of his role as her silent protector. He would ride in, exchange a few quiet words with Sarah, and his gaze would inevitably find Ilara. There was no longer the cold, assessing quality she had first perceived, but a steady, watchful presence. He never brought up the man who was looking for her, but his presence was a quiet reassurance that he was aware of the threat. One crisp morning, Ilara was down by the creek, washing clothes on the smooth stones, her back aching from the exertion. The sun was bright, but the water was icy cold. She heard the familiar sound of hooves and looked up to see Thorn riding towards her. He dismounted and walked slowly towards the creek bank, his spurs jingling softly. He stopped a few feet away and watched her work for a moment in silence. The rhythm of the washing, the sloshing of water, the sound of fabric against stone. It was a simple, repetitive task, but it felt important, a small assertion of order in a chaotic world. Hard work, he finally said, his voice low. Alara nodded, wringing out a wet shirt. It is. He didn't offer sympathy. Sympathy wasn't his way. He was a man of practicality, of facing facts without adornment. You're getting stronger, he observed. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Alara felt a warmth spread through her chest, a quiet pride. She was getting stronger. Her arms ached, but they were more muscled now. Her endurance had increased. She was adapting, slowly but surely, to the demands of this life. I have to be, she replied, looking up at him. His gaze was steady, meeting hers directly. In his eyes, she saw a depth she hadn't noticed before, a quiet understanding that went beyond the surface. He knew why she had to be strong, why she was pushing herself. He knew she was building herself into something resilient out of necessity, out of the need to survive the past that hunted her. The man in town, Alara began, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. The one asking questions. Did he leave? Thorn's expression remained neutral, but his eyes held a flicker of caution. He stayed for a few days, asked around. Didn't get anything. Because you didn't tell him? Alara stated, a quiet certainty in her voice. He didn't confirm it with words, but the subtle shift in his posture, the way his gaze held hers, was confirmation enough. He had protected her. Why? She asked, the question a quiet plea for understanding. Why didn't you tell him? You're a ranger. I came here under a false name. I wasn't honest. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over the creek, the trees, the wide sky. When he looked back at her, his eyes were clear and steady. He wasn't asking questions the way a lawman asks, he said, his voice low. He was asking questions the way a wolf hunts. The analogy sent a shiver down Alara's spine. A wolf hunts, not for justice but for prey. That was exactly what the man from her past was doing. He wasn't interested in legal proceedings. He was interested in retribution or control. Thorn had seen that difference. He had seen the nature of the threat and recognized it as something outside the bounds of simple law enforcement. And you protected me, she said softly. He didn't say yes. He didn't explain his motives. He simply said, didn't see any reason to help a wolf. It was a simple, stark explanation, devoid of sentimentality. He hadn't protected her because she was good or deserving, but because the man hunting her was predatory, dangerous. It was a form of justice, perhaps, but one rooted in the harsh, elemental morality of the wild, not the complex, often corruptible justice of the city she had fled. His words, and the quiet strength behind them, had a profound effect on Alara. He saw the truth not just in her lies, but in the nature of the forces that were pursuing her. He saw her not just as a woman with a secret, but as someone facing a wolf. And he had chosen not to aid the predator. Thank you, Thorn, she said again, feeling the inadequacy of the words to express the depth of her gratitude. He finally gave her a small, genuine nod. It wasn't a smile, but it was a recognition, a shared understanding. In that moment, standing by the creek with the cold water on her hands and the vast, indifferent sky above, Alara felt a sense of connection with this quiet, stoic man that transcended words and circumstances. He knew her secret, had seen her at her most vulnerable, and had chosen to stand, however silently, on her side. It was the beginning of a trust built not on shared stories, but on shared observation, quiet understanding, and the elemental choice between predator and prey. The past was still a threat, but she faced it now with a strength she hadn't known she possessed, and the quiet, unexpected protection of a ranger who saw the truth behind the facade. The fragile truce with her past held for a time, a tense quiet broken only by the relentless demands of the land and the occasional, reassuring presence of Thorn. Alara continued to work at the cabin, her hands growing harder, her body leaner and stronger. She learned to draw water from the creek without slipping on the icy stones, to chop firewood with increasing efficiency, to recognize the signs of changing weather. Sarah remained quiet, observant, her acceptance a silent acknowledgement of Alara's efforts. Thorn rode out regularly, sometimes spending hours talking quietly with Sarah, sometimes simply sitting on the porch, cleaning his rifle, his gaze sweeping the surrounding landscape. He was a watchful sentinel, and Alara knew, without him saying a word, that he was not only patrolling his territory but also keeping an eye out for the wolf that might return. His quiet presence was a constant, low hum of security beneath the surface of her fear. One blustery afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon, approaching the cabin at a fast pace. Alara's heart leaped into her throat. Instinctively, she looked to Thorn, who was mending a fence nearby. He had stopped his work, his body still, his gaze fixed on the approaching figure. Sarah emerged from the cabin, standing beside him. As the rider drew nearer, Alara recognized him with a sickening lurch. It was the man from her past, the city man Thorn had described. He was closer this time, having clearly continued his search, extending his reach beyond the town. He rode with the purposeful air of a man who expected to find what he was looking for. Thorn walked slowly towards the cabin, meeting Sarah by the porch. He didn't tell Alara what to do. He didn't need to. The moment his body tensed, the moment his hand rested casually near the holster on his hip, Alara knew. The quiet watchfulness had transitioned into a silent, active defense. The man reined in his horse a distance from the cabin, dismounting with a stiff, city-dweller's grace that looked entirely out of place in the rugged landscape. He was dressed in dark, expensive clothes, and his eyes, as they scanned the cabin and the figures gathered there, were cold and calculating. He saw Sarah, he saw Thorn, and his gaze finally settled on Alara, who had come to stand beside Sarah. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "There you are," he called out, his voice carrying on the wind, smooth and dangerous. "Miss Atherton. Or should I say, Mrs. Thorn?" The sound of her real name, spoken by him, felt like a violation. He knew everything. He knew she was a fraud, using a dead man's name. Her carefully constructed facade, her adopted identity, crumbled under the weight of his gaze and his words. Thorn took a step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Sarah and Alara. He didn't draw his weapon, but his posture was one of quiet readiness. "You lost?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of the city man's polished malice. The man ignored Thorn, his eyes fixed on Alara. "You caused a great deal of trouble, Alara," he said, his tone deceptively mild. "Running away like that, disappearing." "I had my reasons," Alara said, her voice trembling slightly, but defiance hardening her resolve. "Reasons that don't matter," he countered. "Your debts must be paid. Your obligations met." He took a step forward. "You belong back where you came from." Thorn shifted, his body blocking the man's path. "She's with us now," he stated, his voice still quiet, but carrying an unyielding authority that brooked no argument. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a declaration. "She is with us now." In the eyes of this silent ranger, Alara was no longer just a woman with a secret, but someone under his protection, part of the fragile order he maintained in this territory. The city man's smile vanished, replaced by a look of irritation and contempt. He glanced at Thorn's badge. "You're a ranger? This doesn't concern you. This is private business." "Out here," Thorn said, his gaze steady, "everything concerns me." The tension stretched, thick and heavy in the air. The wind whipped around them, carrying dust and the scent of pine. The city man measured Thorn, recognizing the quiet strength and unwavering resolve. He was used to intimidation, to using money and influence to get his way. Thorn was a different kind of obstacle entirely, one rooted in the harsh realities of this land, not the paper agreements of the city. "She's wanted," the man said, raising his voice slightly, trying to inject legal authority into his claim, "for irregularities." Thorn didn't react. He had known she was running from something. Irregularities was likely a polite term for something far more serious, something perhaps not criminal in the eyes of the law, but ruinous in the eyes of society, something she had been forced into or framed for. He didn't need the details. He had seen the wolf. "You got a warrant?" Thorn asked, his tone neutral, placing the burden of proof squarely on the city man. The man hesitated. A warrant would involve official channels, questions, paperwork. His methods were clearly less formal, more direct. "I represent parties who have a claim," he hedged. "Claims don't hold much weight out here without a warrant," Thorn said. His hand remained near his holster. The city man's face tightened with frustration. He was losing control of the situation. He hadn't anticipated this quiet, immovable resistance. "She's a runaway," he snapped, his veneer of civility cracking. "She's a fraud. She came here under false pretenses." He directed his gaze at Sarah, trying to enlist her in his cause. "She used your brother's name." Sarah met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She knew Alara had used her brother's name. She knew Alara's story was incomplete, likely fabricated in parts. But she had also seen Alara's fear, her hard work, her determination to survive. She said nothing, her silence a powerful statement of solidarity, of choosing the woman who had sought refuge over the man who hunted her. The city man looked back at Thorn, his eyes blazing with anger. "You're interfering, Ranger. You don't know who you're dealing with." Thorn finally spoke, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "I know a wolf when I see one, and this ain't your territory." He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. The message was clear: leave, now. The city man hesitated, his eyes darting between Thorn, Sarah's silent defiance, and Alara, who stood straighter now, drawing strength from their unexpected stand. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered in this environment. He was a predator, but he wasn't a fool. He saw the quiet readiness in Thorn, the unyielding support from Sarah. With a look of pure venom directed at Alara, the city man turned and walked back towards his horse. He mounted swiftly, casting one last, furious glance at the cabin and its inhabitants. "This isn't over, Alara," he shouted, his voice carried away by the wind. "They can't protect you forever." He spurred his horse and rode away, disappearing back the way he came. The tension didn't dissipate immediately. Thorn watched until the rider was out of sight, his hand still near his holster. Sarah remained by his side, her gaze following the retreating figure. Alara felt a shaky breath escape her lips. The confrontation was over, but the threat remained. Thorn finally lowered his hand, the tension draining from his body. He turned to look at Alara. His gaze was direct, assessing. He had seen her confrontation with her past, seen her strength and her fear. "He'll be back," Thorn stated, stating the unavoidable truth. "Or send others." Alara nodded, the reality settling in. She couldn't hide forever. "Why?" she asked again, looking at Thorn, then at Sarah. "Why did you do that? You could have." "Didn't like his kind of justice," Thorn said, cutting her off quietly. It was his only explanation, a simple moral code applied to a complex situation. Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm. "You belong here now, Alara. You've earned it." Alara looked at Sarah, stunned. Earned it? After all her lies, her deception? Sarah saw her hard work, her resilience, her willingness to adapt. She saw the woman who had emerged from the terrified city girl, and she offered her acceptance, a belonging Alara had desperately craved. The wind howled around the cabin, but it no longer sounded indifferent. It sounded like the voice of this land, a land that demanded strength and offered, in return, a fierce, hard-won belonging. Alara looked at Thorn, the silent ranger who had seen the truth and defended her, and at Sarah, the dead man's sister who had offered her a place. She had come here with a lie, seeking refuge in a dead man's name. But in fleeing her past, she had found something unexpected. A connection forged in shared hardship, a quiet strength within herself, and the possibility of building a life not on deception, but on resilience and truth, defended by those who had seen past her fear to the strength she possessed. The wolf might return, but she faced the future not as a cornered mouse, but as a woman learning to stand her ground in the wild, with quiet allies by her side. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a promise of another dawn, another day to face the challenges of this demanding, beautiful land, a land where she was slowly, tentatively, beginning to belong. The path ahead was still uncertain, still dangerous, but for the first time, Elara felt a flicker of hope, a belief that survival was possible, that she was capable of facing whatever came next, not alone, but with the quiet strength of Thorn and the unwavering acceptance of Sarah, two people who had seen her truth and helped her find her place in a world that had nearly broken her. The wind, once a sound of desolation, now felt like the breath of the land welcoming her, a testament to her resilience and the unexpected bonds forged in the crucible of hardship. The aftermath of the confrontation settled over the cabin like the evening dust. The immediate danger had receded, but the threat lingered, a shadow cast by the setting sun. Elara felt a profound sense of relief mixed with a lingering fear. The man from her past knew where she was. He would likely return or send others. Hiding was no longer a viable option. She sat on the porch with Sarah as Thorn rode out, disappearing into the twilight to continue his patrol. Sarah didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. She simply sat in companionable silence, watching the stars begin to prick the darkening sky. This quiet solidarity, devoid of unnecessary words, had become a cornerstone of Elara's life here. "He won't stop," Elara said softly, stating the obvious truth. "No," Sarah agreed, her voice equally quiet. "Men like that don't give up easily." "What will I do?" Elara asked, the question directed more at the vast night sky than at Sarah. The desperation she had thought she had overcome resurfaced, cold and sharp. Her elaborate escape had only led her to a temporary haven, one now compromised. Sarah turned her head to look at Elara, her profile outlined against the faint starlight. "You'll face it," she said, her voice steady and certain. "You've faced everything else this far." Elara looked at her, surprised by the quiet confidence in Sarah's tone. Sarah saw her not as the terrified woman who stepped off the train, nor as the fraud who used her brother's name, but as someone capable of facing down the wolf. "How?" Elara asked. "He has power. Influence. Power doesn't always translate out here," Sarah said, her gaze sweeping the dark, empty landscape. "Out here it's about what you can do, about who stands with you, who stood with her." Thorn, Sarah, two people who had no obligation to her, who knew her deception, yet had chosen to protect her. "Thorn," Elara began, her voice filled with a lingering sense of wonder. He lied for me." "Thorn has his own code," Sarah said. "It's not the city's law. It's the land's law. Survival. Protection. He saw you were prey, and he doesn't help the predator." She paused. "He saw your truth, Elara. Not just the one you tried to hide, but the one you are becoming." Elara absorbed her words. Thorn hadn't just seen the lie. He had seen the fear behind it, the strength developing despite it, the determination to survive that mirrored the resilience of the land itself. He had seen her truth not as a static identity, but as something dynamic, something being forged in the crucible of hardship. "I used your brother's name," Elara confessed again, the guilt still a heavy burden. "I deceived you." Sarah reached out and placed a hand on Elara's arm, her touch rough but comforting. "You were desperate," she said. "You made a choice to survive. Out here, that counts for something." She squeezed Elara's arm gently. Tom would have understood. The acceptance in Sarah's voice, the quiet validation of her desperate act, brought tears to Elara's eyes. She had expected judgment, condemnation. Instead, she found understanding, a recognition of the impossible circumstances that had driven her. "He saw you weren't who you claimed," Sarah continued, referring to Thorn. "But he also saw you were honest in your fear, in your willingness to work. He sees the difference between a lie told for malice and a lie told for survival. Your struggle, it's real. He respects that. Respect. The word resonated deep within her. Thorn respected her struggle, her resilience. He saw the woman fighting for her life, not just the woman who had used a dead man's name. In the following days, the quiet routine of the cabin continued, but with an added layer of readiness. Thorn was a more constant presence. His patrols focused on the approaches to the cabin. Alara and Sarah worked side by side, a bond forming between them, a silent sisterhood forged in shared work and the looming threat. The man from the city did not return, but a sense of vigilance permeated the air. Thorn taught Alara how to handle a rifle, her city hands awkward at first, but gaining confidence under his patient, minimal instruction. He didn't push her, simply showed her, letting her learn through practice and observation. There was a quiet trust in these lessons, a transfer of essential knowledge from the capable lawman to the woman who was learning to defend herself. One evening, sitting by the fire, Alara finally spoke of her past, haltingly at first, then with more flow as Sarah listened without interruption, and Thorn sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the flames. She spoke of the circumstances that had led to her flight, the betrayal, the societal condemnation that awaited her. It was a painful confession, airing the shame and fear she had carried for so long. When she finished, the cabin was silent save for the crackling fire. Sarah reached out and covered Alara's hand with her own. Thorn simply nodded, his expression grim. There was no judgment, only a quiet understanding of the forces that could drive a person to such desperate measures. It was a high price, Thorn said, his voice low, referring to her escape, her deception, the life she had lost. It was the only price I could pay, Alara replied. He met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw a reflection of the harsh truths of the world, but also a quiet acknowledgement of the strength it took to survive them. He had seen her at her weakest, fleeing and lying, and he had witnessed her becoming stronger, facing her past, learning to stand her ground. The threat of her past never fully disappeared, but as the weeks turned into months, Alara became more and more rooted in this land. She learned its rhythms, its demands, its quiet rewards. She was no longer the fragile city girl posing as someone else. She was Alara, a woman who drew water from the creek, chopped her own wood, stood shoulder to shoulder with Sarah, and felt a quiet sense of belonging in the shadow of the mountains. Her relationship with Thorn remained largely unspoken, a bond built on shared looks, quiet understanding, and his unwavering, silent protection. He had seen the truth in her lies, but he had also seen the truth of her resilience, her courage, her fundamental desire for a life lived with dignity, even in the dust and the wind. He had guarded her not just from the man who hunted her, but from the possibility of being consumed by her own fear and shame. The past had chased her across a continent, seeking to reclaim her, to punish her. But in fleeing, in accepting the unexpected refuge of a dead man's cabin and the quiet protection of a discerning ranger, she had not only survived but had begun to build something new. She had faced the wolf and found strength in unlikely allies. She had shed the skin of her old life, the lies and the fear, and was slowly, tentatively, becoming whole in the vast, wild landscape that demanded honesty and rewarded resilience. The future was uncertain, the threat potentially lingering, but Alara faced it standing taller, her gaze steadier, her heart filled not with the fear of being found out, but with the quiet strength of a woman who had faced her truth and found her place in a world that had tried to break her. A world where a silent ranger had seen her struggle and chosen to stand with her.